This is the second recording for chapter 4 on tissues, and we are on slide 28. We're finishing up with epithelial tissue. So stratified epithelial tissue, it has more than one layer, and mostly it's for protection. The best example of stratified squamous epithelial tissue is the epidermis of the skin. Okay. So stratified squamous is many layers, and the cells on top are actually squamous. Now, if you look closer to the bottom, those are more cuboidal. And so we're going to say epidermis of the skin is our example. Layers of squamous cells, okay? Mainly, at least at the top anyway. So epidermis of the skin, but it's also stratified squamous tissue that is lining like the inside of your mouth and the cells that form the lining of your throat and your esophagus. Those are all stratified squamous too. The difference is the tissue that forms the epidermis of your skin is keratinized. It has the cells at the apical surface, I guess you would say. The cells at the very top here are going to be filled with keratin. But stratified squamous can be non-keratinized. So in the openings, in body openings, like your mouth, anus, opening to your ears and your nostrils, vagina, any openings to the outside, they are going to be stratified squamous, but it's going to be non-keratinized. The cells on the top don't fill with keratin. Now, there are stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar tissues, but they're very rare, and I'm going to skip them. So the only stratified epithelial tissue that you really need to learn is stratified squamous, and that forms the epidermis of the skin. Now, there is a special type of epithelial tissue called transitional. This is going to take on a different appearance depending on if the tissue is stretched or if it is not stretched. So think about your bladder, your urinary bladder, which fills with urine, and then sometimes it's full and sometimes it's empty. When it's full and stretched, the transitional epithelial cells look more squamous. They look more flat. But actually there are fewer layers of cells whenever the bladder is full. And then when the bladder is empty, you actually have more layers of cells and they are taller. Okay, so the appearance of transitional epithelium changes based on if the tissue is stretched or not. And we find transitional lining the urinary bladder. Then we have glands. So we're going to talk about glands a little bit. Glands function in secretion. So whatever the glands produces and releases is called a secretion. There are two types of glands, two main types of glands. There's endocrine glands and exocrine glands. And actually your pancreas functions as both an endocrine and an exocrine gland. But here's what the difference is. The main difference is what they produce and then the way that they travel. So endocrine glands produce hormones. Their secretion is always a hormone. And hormones are released into the blood and travel through the bloodstream, sometimes far from the place that they were produced. Exocrine glands secrete their products onto a surface through a duct, D-U-C-T, a duct, like your sweat glands have sweat gland ducts, and the sweat is secreted through the duct onto the surface of your skin. Now, it doesn't have to be the surface of your skin. It can be a surface like there are secretions from the pancreas that are released inside of your small intestine. Okay? So the surface that we're talking about would be the lining of the inside of your small intestine. So the main thing, though, is that exocrine glands release their product through a duct, whereas the endocrine hormones are going through the blood vessels. Now, we're not going to go into the structure too much of exocrine glands. There's a whole lot of information on whether they're unicellular, multicellular, all that. When we get to that, if we're not going to cover it, I'll tell you. But there is some information that I skipped because this can be a pretty long chapter if you don't cut some parts of it out. So endocrine glands don't have ducts. They produce hormones, and the hormones travel either through the lymphatic fluid or blood, but it's almost always the blood. So I'm just going to highlight blood because that's mostly what it is. Hormones that are released into the blood and travel through blood vessels to their target. Now, exocrine glands secrete their products through a duct onto some surface, and they include mucus glands, sweat glands, oil glands, salivary glands, the glands that come from the pancreas, the exocrine glands from the pancreas that release digestive enzymes. All right, so here I'm just going to point something out. We aren't going to really worry about the structure of exocrine glands, whether they're unicellular or multicellular, but I do want to tell you about goblet cells. Goblet cells are found in between the epithelial cells that form the lining of your intestine, and they produce mucin. And mucin is a substance found in mucus. So mucin mixes with water and forms mucus. Mucin is actually a sugar dash protein. That means it's a protein that contains sugar attached to it. So anyway, it forms a slimy, protective, lubricating coating, particularly in the digestive tract, because if you think about it, your stomach has all that acid in there, and it has enzymes that can actually digest the stomach tissue. I mean, you could digest yourself. That's what happens when you have stomach ulcers, is that the enzymes in the stomach were actually breaking down and digesting your tissue that forms your stomach, So anyway, the mucin that mixes with water, the mucus, actually protects the lining of the stomach. And the cells that produce that are called goblet cells. And here's what they look like. Goblet cells, they look like a little bit shaped like a water goblet. And that's why they're called goblet cells. But they are exocrine glands. And we're going to skip whether or not they're tubular, alveolar, tubulo-alveolar. Just forget all that. Simple, compound. I don't care about that, but I do care about this. Okay? With exocrine glands, I do want you to know the difference between a merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine exocrine gland. Okay? So, just to be clear, endocrine glands produce hormones and release those hormones into the blood, and we're not learning any different types of endocrine glands. So endocrine glands, pretty simple, straightforward. They produce hormones, release the hormones into the blood. Now, exocrine glands, we have to know a little bit more information because there's 3 types, but exocrine glands release their secretion into a duct and then onto a surface. So, if the glands are merocrine, if they're merocrine secretions, then they release their product by exocytosis, and the cell that releases that product, the cell is not damaged at all. That cell continues to be healthy and release more secretion. It does not alter the cells at all. The cells that form the merocrine glands are not altered at all. They remain intact and not damaged, okay, by the secretion. So most sweat glands, there's 2 different types of sweat. The watery sweat that doesn't have an odor is merocrine. The pancreas, now I'm not talking about insulin. We all know the pancreas produces insulin. That is a hormone. So the pancreas actually plays a role as an endocrine gland. But in this case, we are talking about the role of the pancreas as an exocrine gland, producing digestive enzymes. So the secretions from the pancreas that are released into the small intestine to help with digestion. Those are merocrine secretions, and the salivary glands produce merocrine secretions. So that means the cells that produce those secretions and release those secretions are not altered or changed. Then we have apocrine. In apocrine secretions, only the apex, that means the top half of the cell is shed along with the secretion. Okay? So then the cell repairs the damage and repeats the process. But it is damaged slightly by releasing the secretion. So apocrine secretions can be the secretions from mammary glands, but actually, since this is looks like controversial or debated, we're not going to give that example. I would say I'll give you the example of apocrine secretions are the sweat that doesn't smell good, the thick sweat that has an odor that we release in our axillary region or our arm, under our arms, the underarm sweat. That is apocrine. And the sweat that you release around your, like in your groin area, in your, in between like your butt crack. I don't know. That's not a very anatomical medical term there, but in between your two gluteus maximus. I don't know. Anyway, that thick sweat that has a smell is an apocrine secretion. And when cells release that sweat, the top half of the cell is shed along with the secretion. Then holocrine secretions, the entire cell ruptures and is shed along with the secretion. So oil glands, which we call sebaceous glands in our skin, sebaceous glands release their secretion, which is oil or sebum, and the cell that releases that secretion is destroyed and shed along with the secretion. So, like you can see here, these cells are holocrines. They're releasing holocrine secretions. The cells that release the secretions they rupture and they are shed along with the secretion. Whereas if it's merocrine, the secretion is released and the cell is not damaged. They don't have a picture of apocrine, but you just have to imagine the apocrine secretion, the top part, the apical surface, the top half of that cell would be shed along with the secretion. Okay, now we're moving on to connective tissue. I told you we're going to spend the most time on epithelial and connective. So connective tissue is the most diverse tissue. And so it's going to have a lot of functions. There's 4 main classes. There's connective tissue proper. And I guess the only reason we call it that is because it doesn't have a specific name. So all the connective tissue that doesn't have like a specific name is just connective tissue proper. So it's just connective tissue. And then we have specific names for cartilage, bone, blood, and there's also lymph that's not listed here. But the fluid connective tissues are blood and lymph. And then solid connective tissues are bone and cartilage. And all the other connective tissue is called connective tissue proper. Okay, so we need to, before we go into that, so here is what makes connective tissue different from epithelial and muscle tissue and nervous tissue. Connective tissue does have cells, but the cells are surrounded by extracellular matrix. This is the non-living portion of the tissue. And the extracellular matrix is composed of ground tissue and protein fibers. So the ground substance and the protein fibers make up the matrix of connective tissue, and all of that matrix surrounds the cells of the connective tissue. So cells are separated by a non-living substance called matrix, okay? Now, and every type of connective tissue has a different type of matrix, but for right now, let's talk about the types of connective tissue or the examples. And it's going to be the same thing here. I'll give you an example. I'll describe it to you. So you need to know the description of the structure and where it's located in the body. Connective tissue proper is divided into loose and dense, which is just like it sounds. Loose connective tissue is looser, dense connective tissue is thicker and stronger. All right, loose connective tissue has three different types: areolar connective tissue, adipose connective tissue, and reticular connective tissue. All right, and then for your dense, you have regular connective tissue, irregular connective tissue, and elastic. Then for the specific connective tissues that have names, actual names, cartilage, there's hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, which is different from elastic connective tissue, okay? Elastic cartilage is different from just elastic dense connective tissue, okay? They're two different things. And then fibrocartilage. So hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Then we have bone, which is divided into compact and spongy bone. And then we have blood and we have lymph. And I don't know why lymph is not listed here, but it's not. I mean, lymph is a fluid connective tissue too, but it's just not listed here. Okay, so we are going to look at examples of connective tissue and images of connective tissue and where it's located in the body. All right. Okay, I'll do this. We'll go over examples in the next recording, but let's go ahead and finish up the composition of connective tissue in general. All right, so remember we said that all connective tissue has cells that are surrounded by matrix, extracellular matrix. The matrix is composed of ground substance and fibers. So those are protein fibers. So this is a list of the protein fibers. There's collagen fibers for strength. It is the strongest and most abundant type. Elastic fibers for flexibility and elasticity. They allow for stretch and recoil. And then reticular fibers, which are very thin, but they're thin branching fibers. And because of that, they form like a network of fibers. I'll tell you where you find reticular fibers mostly is in, like, think about organs that you have in your body that are not hollow, they're solid all the way through, like the liver. And those organs, like if you've ever seen a chicken liver before it's cooked or even after it's cooked, they're solid organs, but the tissue is mushy. It's kind of a soft, mushy tissue. So your liver, your lymph nodes, your spleen, all of those are mushy. And I don't know a better word. So reticular fibers are found in that type of tissue that forms organs like the liver. Elastic fibers are for elasticity, and collagen fibers are for strength. Then we have the different cells you can find in connective tissue. Now, if the cell has the word blast in the name, it means that it produces something, it makes something. It produces the part of the matrix of that tissue. If it has the word site, then the word site means cell. So they're just cells that are mature, and they just function in maintenance of the tissue. So some of the cells that we see are fibroblasts, and they're cells in connective tissue that produce the protein fibers that we just named. Chondroblasts produce cartilage matrix, and osteoblasts produce bone matrix. So fibroblasts, when they're mature, they will become fibrocytes. Mature chondroblasts will become chondrocytes, and mature osteoblasts will become osteocytes. So if you see chondro, it's going to refer to cartilage cells, and osteo refers to bone cells. And immature blood cells are called hematopoietic. Hematopoietic stem cells are immature blood cells, and they can actually form into any of the blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. That's hematopoietic stem cells. Those are immature blood cells. So just remember, fibroblast, if it has blast in the name, it produces something. So fibroblasts produce protein fibers. Chondroblasts produce cartilage matrix. Osteoblasts produce bone matrix. And then all of these cells become mature cells, and instead of blasts, they have cyte at the end of their name. So I'll give you an example, an osteoblast, for example, okay? That's a bone cell that is producing bone matrix around it. So once that osteoblast is surrounded by bone matrix, then it will mature and become an osteocyte. And other cells will be adipocytes, which are fat cells. Leukocytes are special white, that's just the name for white blood cells. There's all different kinds. Mast cells are cells that release histamine and other chemicals. So they kind of have a role in the inflammatory response and defense, defending us against microorganisms, but mainly they're involved in the inflammatory response. So those are called mast cells. And then some white blood cells are called macrophages. Macrophages engulf bacteria or cells that are cells that contain viruses, and they engulf them and destroy them. So I'm going to stop here, and then we'll start the next recording with slide number 53.